Welcome everyone to our Faculty Research Symposium. My name is Brian. I'm just here to get you all oriented really quickly. So just want to make a few announcements and let you know that captions are available in this Zoom webinar. So you can select the captioning option in the bottom of your Zoom toolbar if you'd like to enable those. Those of you who are attending today, your video and audio are automatically turned off. So you don't have to worry about being visible in today's event. But please use the chat to communicate with one another and our presenters. Again, just make sure you select all panelists and attendees when adding to the chat. And our presenters will answer questions after their remarks. If you'd like to ask a question verbally, you can choose the raise hand button in the bottom of your Zoom toolbar as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to our Dean Heather Lattimer to give some opening remarks.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I was actually just on the phone with Mark Felton. We're having some technical difficulties. So typically he would be the one giving these opening remarks, but hopefully he'll be able to join us shortly. In the interim, just really want to say thank you so much to both Allison and Roxana for presenting today. It is certainly a busy time. We were just chatting before we opened the webinar about how crazy busy everyone is. And in many ways, that means that this is, one more thing, but in a lot of ways, it's also critically important to have this now because it grounds the work that we do. When we're in the middle of grading and end of semester exams and email and all the different things about how on earth we're coming back to class and to campus in the fall, it is important to have the grounding of why the work matters. And so the research presentations that we're going to hear today, I think will help us all to engage in that larger conversation and ground us in the work that we do day to day. So with that, I will pass it off to Allison. I think you're first, yes? Excellent. So really thrilled to hear from Allison to share her research.
Thank you so much, Heather and Brian and Mark, who isn't here yet, but I'm sure will join us when he can. I'm going to just share with you a study that I've done with our pre-service teachers. My name is Allison Briceño. I'm an associate professor in the teacher education department, and I'm honored to be here alongside my amazing office mate, Roxana. So thank you so much for this opportunity. For today, I'll briefly introduce myself and then describe a study focused on incorporating culturally sustaining pedagogy in a literacy methods course. I'll provide a little background and details about the course, share the main findings, and then show an example or two of the student-created books that were studied. I chose to share this study because my students really loved the assignment and they were incredibly proud of the books they created. This diagram is a brief overview of my work on biliteracy development and culturally sustaining pedagogy in biliteracy. With the bilingual child at the center, I explore how in-service and pre-service teachers support emergent bilinguals' language and literacy development and how to prepare teacher candidates to best serve emergent bilingual students. I also consider how policies affect bilingual students. My interest in biliteracy and culturally sustaining pedagogy stems from my own lack of a heritage language. I'm a white woman of Italian descent, which was important to me growing up. However, I don't speak any Italian. I'm the result of language loss that occurs when cultures and languages are not sustained, like many of us, I'm sure. So I'd like to recognize my colleague, Dr. Claudia Rodriguez Mojica, with whom I collaborated on this project. We revised and resubmitted a manuscript about it just a few months ago. We are both bilingual teachers, teacher educators, and researchers, and this study stemmed from our desire to improve our teaching and more effectively prepare candidates to work with the diverse students in the Bay Area. And so in case there are any teacher education MAT students out there, know that this project is truly an inquiry, very similar to what you're doing. For this study I'm sharing today, I looked at a small group assignment that I used in the literacy methods course in our multiple subject teacher preparation program. The assignment asked students to author a children's book from the perspective of an underrepresented group, and I intentionally kept that very broad. The assignment is the culmination of the semester, but it's important to note that the development of culturally sustaining pedagogy and critical consciousness were intentionally developed throughout the semester. And I'd like to show you one of the student-created books that resulted from this assignment so you have a better sense of what we'll be talking about. The book is called Beverly's Monster. And, excuse me. And so you'll see this is a scan of it. It's not a high-tech version. Later, I'll show you a more high-tech version. Students have their choice as to how they want to do that. So it was written by Sarah Kowalski, Emily Ann Powell, and Eloise Rippey. Emily was also an incredible artist, as you'll see. So they chose to handwrite and illustrate it. Most people tend to use PowerPoint or another technology, but the pictures here are just beautiful. So my friend Beverly has a monster that follows her wherever she goes. Sometimes her monster is so small that she doesn't even notice it, and you can see it down there in the bottom left hand corner. Sometimes her monster is so big it won't even let her get out of bed. Sometimes her monster whispers mean things to her, and sometimes she believes it. Beverly's monster can't be seen by any of the rest of us, but we all know it's there. Sometimes Beverly wants to be alone with her monster, and sometimes she wants to talk about her monster with me. I make sure to ask first. Beverly's monster isn't scary, but it does make her sad, and that can be hard to see. Sometimes I get mad at Beverly's monster, and sometimes I get mad at Beverly. But then I remember that Beverly and her monster are my friends, and she's friends with my monster too. So I love that book, and it's so brief that I thought it would be an easy way to let you see what I'm referring to here. And the beautiful thing is that the group that created that book made it so concrete by actually having a monster, right? Anxiety and depression, which are these really complex things, become very concrete that way. So I'm going to, I apologize, I have to stop sharing and reshare. Okay. The problem that this study addresses is systemic. So nationally, 80% of the teaching force is white, but 53% of students are students of color. Social, racial, and economic differences and different languages and literacy practices are traditionally seen through a deficit lens, and therefore teacher candidates must learn to examine and transform problematic systems of power.
Hey, Allison.
Yes.
Right now we can see the presenter view of your slides.
Oh, you can't see the whole thing. Okay.
Yeah, if you want to just switch over to the other view.
I apologize.
No worries.
Thank you for letting me know, Brian.
Yep.
Hang on one second. It doesn't want to show.
Okay, we've all been there.
Yeah. And Brian helped me practice before too, so.
This is the year of being very transparent about our learning processes.
Exactly. How does it look now, Brian?
Great.
Okay, thank you, Heather. So teacher education is not immune to systemic racism. And as Haddock says, instead of being in programs that acknowledge their cultural knowledges and center on curriculum and practice, students of color are expected to excel in whiteness-centered teacher education programs. For students of color, becoming a teacher means erasing or hiding their racial, linguistic, cultural, and sexual identities to fit a set standard. And so we used culturally sustaining pedagogy as the theoretical lens to explore this problem. And CSP, or culturally sustaining pedagogy, seeks to perpetuate and foster or to sustain linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism as part of the democratic project of schooling. So I'll share the methods briefly that we used. Our research questions addressed are the following. What diversity topics did teacher candidates pursue in the creation of their books and why? How were course concepts evidenced in the student authored text? And how did the assignment shift teacher candidates' awareness of underrepresented communities and culturally sustaining pedagogical practices? So today I'll address the first two briefly and focus on the third. This study took place in a one-year post-bac teacher preparation program. Participants included 77 teacher candidates across 3 sections of the literacy methods course over 2 semesters. 58% self-identified as white and 90% as female. The data was collected a few years back and included student-created books like you saw and anonymous surveys. And as you know, classroom culture is critically important when doing this work, and I'm very intentional about it. I think it helps that our program has a cohort model, so students are familiar with one another, and I get to build on the classroom communities developed by my colleagues in the first semester of our program. So the work really starts on day 1 with the concept of literacy capital. Only certain forms of literacy are valued in schools. The students do a language and literacy autobiography at the very beginning of the semester that investigates their literacy identities and builds on prior coursework to apply concepts to teachers, candidates' lived experiences. Throughout the course, I use diverse texts. We analyze them, and I model them all semester. The teacher candidates complete a classroom library audit to investigate representation in their student teaching classrooms. There's an assignment to analyze diverse texts. I model and discuss the use of problematic texts. So my main point here is that a lot of work is done to prepare to develop critical consciousness and CSP throughout the semester. It's not a standalone assignment, and I think it could be problematic if it were used that way. So the assignment itself, we start by brainstorming issues generally underrepresented in children's literature. And we form small groups based on topics of interest. At least one person must personally be part of the underrepresented group, usually more. You'll see teacher candidates usually kind of group themselves together that way. They also have to interview at least one additional in-group person and do a member check of a draft of the book with that person. The instructor meets regularly with the small groups and they workshop drafts with one another. We keep an eye out for tokenism and make sure that everything is, that representation is done very respectfully. And so moving into the findings. So the first research question was what diversity topics were selected and why? And I was pleased to find that a wider range of topics was covered than I would have been able to address in one semester in depth by myself. The students were learning from one another about their lived experiences during the semester and then shared their books with the class in the last session. These are just a few of the issues addressed in their books: immigration, LGBTQ, mental emotional health, as you saw with Beverly's Monster, neurodiversity issues, substance abuse, race, religion, foster care, child abuse, first generation college experiences. And that's really just what fit on the slide. I was really pleased about the diversity of topics. The teacher candidates tended to self-select into alike groups based on shared experiences, and I think there's pros and cons to that. And the teacher candidates selected topics based on a personal connection to themselves or their students. So for example, one student said, being biracial is something that I used to be ashamed of, but now that I'm older, I'm loud and proud of it. I've never seen books about being biracial, so I wanted to take this opportunity to share my own story and experiences. Another student said, I didn't grow up reading about first generation college students, so being able to put my story out there to share made it feel valued, right? And that's exactly what we want them to do for their students. The literacy methods course is the only literacy course students get, so it's chock full of content and still barely skims the surface. I was pleased to find that I could teach the core literacy concepts through culturally sustaining pedagogy. CSP didn't take the place of the literacy content. So going forward for me, the question is not whether I have the time to also teach CSP, but whether I have the will to do the work it requires to reconsider how I'm teaching and reframe the content through culturally sustaining pedagogies. I was also pleased to see that the student-created books served as a good assessment of both traditional literacy concepts, such as audience and genre, as well as some aspects of CSP. Sometimes social justice-oriented work is done in a vacuum, somewhat outside of or in addition to the core content. And so it was important to me as the instructor that I was able to integrate culturally sustaining pedagogies with the more traditional literacy concepts so that my students got both. So the assignment shifted teacher candidates' awareness of underrepresented communities and their own teaching in a few ways. It deepened their awareness of those communities. It increased a desire and willingness to learn about other communities and cultures. It facilitated their implementation of culturally sustaining pedagogies in their own classrooms and supported an understanding of intersectionality. And I'll give you some examples from the student surveys to explain what I mean. So one student said, being white, I didn't realize that this book topic that they wrote about is such an issue with children. Another said, I was able to recognize my own biases and learn more about underrepresented groups. I feel with them instead of against them. A third said, I realized that it's important to connect with all of my students and not just some of them. And what was striking here to me is that the teacher candidates' acknowledgement of their own progress and honesty about their own feelings and the shifts that they themselves have made. Another student said, the sharing at the end of the semester brought it all together for me. Seeing how there are many different topics that just aren't represented in the classroom really made this powerful. Another said, it made me see what kind of teacher I want to be. So the sharing of the books at the end of the semester really broadened the teacher candidates' understanding of the potential diverse lived experiences of their students. And it helped them to see that when we tell them to get to know your students, it's actually a much more complex undertaking than they initially think. So just a few more comments. One said, this assignment really helped me to think about how to broach difficult topics in a child-friendly fashion, right? And I think that the example of Beverly's Monster really does a nice job of that, of showing that. Another student said, all of our students deserve to share their stories in authentic and meaningful ways. And then finally, someone said, it was an empowering assignment. So the teacher candidates left the class with an understanding of how they can use books to address controversial issues with young children, as well as the importance of supporting students to use their own voices and tell their own stories. However, there's definitely some considerations about how to use this. For example, it would be really great in the future if I may have my students write in collaboration with a community member or a student's family member, if I can get that to work. It's important to work to avoid tokenism. That's kind of an ongoing issue with this assignment. The question of when and in which circumstances to avoid monoglossic grouping has arisen. And there's pros and cons to that I won't get into, but it's a question I have for going forward. And then importantly, culturally sustaining pedagogy is not a teacher preparation standard, but literacy methods courses, at least this one, can be taught through CSP. And that's, again, for me, that's a helpful thing to know. So I want to just take the last few minutes. Brian, do I have a few minutes to share some of these books?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I will be quick. Maybe not as quick as I thought. Okay, can you see this?
Yeah.
Perfect. So this book you can see is called Cursed Treasures. And this is a higher tech example. It's written by Alma Fernandez, Chao Chavez, and Megan Morris Quevedo for grades 3rd through 4th grades. And what they did here was they actually read it. So I'm gonna play it for you.
The rain came down hard that night. The water crashed on the tin roof. I heard thunder and lightning from far away. Plink, plink, plink. Boom, clap, crash. I was not afraid. I was in my mother's lap. I felt safe and warm. I begged my mother to tell us a scary story. My mother began to tell us the story of the cursed treasures.
So I won't play it for you, but I do just want to show you how they used pictures and captions and all kinds of things to tell the story along with the text and the audio. And it's really beautiful. And this is a story that a student's parent told to the teacher candidates that they collaboratively wrote together. So that is one book. And then the other, very briefly, is a bilingual book. And again, this is another lower tech book that called Sentimientos Encontrados, the story of a first generation American. And so these students, there were 5 students in this group. 4 of them were bilingual. They were all first generation students. And they created a bilingual book. So for example, on this page, the text is in English, and then this would be the opposing page. I'm sorry, it's in English on the top and it's in Spanish on the bottom. Here, the text is in English on the left, and then it's in Spanish on the right. And the text is the same, it's just that there's a translation, right? So you can see this is just another really beautiful, beautiful way that they were able to tell their own story in a really effective, in ways that were really effective for students. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to either Brian or Roxana or Heather, whoever's up. Thank you.
I think we've got a couple minutes for questions. If anybody has questions or ideas or connections that they'd like to share, and I apologize, you caught me mid-bite. So if you have questions, if you want to drop them in the chat, that would be great. And while people are thinking about questions, Allison, I'll just share that I really appreciate, first of all, I love hearing the stories and having those sprinkled throughout, and appreciate the way in which you framed the work. And, you know, I'm thinking about the tension that you kind of said that, you know, this can, that we can engage in culturally sustaining pedagogies within our literacy classes. And sometimes it's seen as either or, and you're saying it should be both and, that this should be a foundation, an approach that grounds the work to then have the literacy content and the literacy tools that are taught within a culturally sustaining approach. And it seems like that's a framing that can extend beyond literacy to many of our methods classes and foundations classes across our, not just teacher education department, but other departments in our college as well. All right, I'm seeing some questions. So there's one from Kimberly that says, in the small groups where each group had to have at least one person from an underrepresented group, what measures were taken to make sure that those students didn't feel like they were being tokenized?
Yeah, and so that's kind of the biggest trick with this assignment. I try to give, back in the old days when we used to be in person, is when I did this, and we would meet in person. And so I would give 20 minutes at the end of class, and I would be sure to kind of check in. A lot of it had to do with me being hands-on with the groups, but we also discussed tokenism, and I had showed them examples of tokenism in books, right? And we talked about when is something authentic and when is it a stereotype or something like that. So they had a good amount of experience with that. And then if something escaped me and it escaped the other members of the group, because generally all 4 folks were actually in group, that was that external person that they had as well, who they interviewed. They also do a member check with that person. But that idea of kind of avoiding the tokenism and ensuring that everything is done respectfully is the biggest, the most difficult, I guess, aspect of this. Thank you for that question.
Absolutely. I think we've got time for one more, and there's several others in the chat, but the next one that came in was, what were some diverse texts used to model?
So lots and lots, and everything from like jump rope chants for shared reading that come from like the Dominican Heights neighborhoods in New York, to books like Skippy John Jones, which is actually pretty problematic, right? And so I think what was helpful was modeling texts that really did show great diversity, and then also including some that were like, this is a really popular book. How do we handle this, right? Because it is problematic. So having those discussions was really important. One thing that was always striking to me was how open the student teachers were in saying, you know, I'm really uncomfortable with talking about these things. How do I do this? And that was, those were some of the most interesting conversations that we had, was because the student teachers were so great and so open to having those conversations.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. And I see that Mark is here. Fantastic. So I am thank you for overcoming our technical hurdles here, and delighted to have you take the lead on introducing Roxana and her work. And also, I should just make sure that we recognize and appreciate the work that you did in setting these forums up. They've been critically important as we're ensuring that we're having these conversations with our faculty to share the great work they're doing.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, and 1 year into distance learning, and apparently you can still have things go wrong with Zoom. So here we are. It's my great pleasure to introduce my dear colleague, Roxana Marachi, and her upcoming talk, which is entitled Philanthro-Capitalism and Equity Doublespeak, when innovation is exploitation and silicon solutions fuel next level systemic racism. Roxana, I look forward to asking some questions after your talk, but I'd like to just move on and hand things over to you right now.
Thank you so much. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is a really difficult presentation for me to make. I volunteered to make it, but the topic is really heavy. It's really timely and current. And most of what I'm going to be presenting today, I had done research from in the last 9 years. So it was pre-pandemic, but some of the emerging technologies that I'm going to be talking about we're really on the cusp of and are extremely important for us to pay attention to. My early research was on violence prevention and bullying prevention in schools. And so I had a lens towards this definition of bullying, this power differential. There's, power difference, and there's repeated harm against those with less power. And as I've dug into the research on, looking at schools and policies, social emotional learning, violence prevention in schools, I've grown increasingly concerned about the macro level violence prevention that we need to do around the bullies, or those with the most power in our society, which tend to be those in the financial industry and in the tech industry, and the ways that they're influencing education. So that's just kind of a backdrop to the presentation I'm going to be giving. And I have a little disclaimer at the bottom. Note the views presented here are those are mine, and not necessarily the position of San Jose State or Lurie College of Education. I've learned that we need to do this to protect academic freedom. And so I want to start with two constant notes. Because the title of my talk is really long, right? It is still, Philanthro-Capitalism and Equity Doublespeak, when innovation is exploitation and silicon solutions fuel next level systemic racism. One of my students last night said, what is that about, right? So there's a lot. And I think that it can be captured to some extent with these two contrasting quotes. Information is the new gold. It's the new oil. It's like diamonds. It's worth trillions of dollars. And if you control that, you control wealth, you control power. This is a quote from the Kill Switch documentary. It's about the origins of the internet. And then a contrasting one. These systems are so opaque to us that sometimes we don't even know when we've been denied an opportunity because of an algorithm. And this is from a documentary called Coded Bias, directed by Shalini Kantaya, who was able to join us last week for a question and answer session about the documentary. And I highly recommend it, Coded Bias. It's a great way to learn about some of these concerns. And to build on my colleague, Dr. Briceño's work, I invite you to think about the trends that I'm going to be sharing about in this presentation, and to think, are these culturally sustaining, or are they a form of cultural erasing? So Philanthro-Capitalism, let's start with the first word of the title. You know, oftentimes people think of philanthropy as it's just this giving, you know, benevolent, let's just give money to those who need it. And there's, in the past 15 years, it's changed considerably. And so what we're seeing right now is something called Philanthro-Capitalism. And with capitalism, as many of you know, the end game is profits. And so this hybrid, this new breed of philanthro-capitalists is also known as venture philanthropy, social entrepreneurship. It's also in the space of social and impact investing. There's a book called How the Rich Can Save the World, Philanthro-Capitalism, How the Rich Can Save the World, by Bishop and Green. And that is not a satirical title, by the way. They actually legit meant it to say that they think that the rich can save the world. There's been a lot written about this, again, in the last 15 years, most prominently in the 2006, The Economist, editors of The Economist really highlighted this for-profit capital markets as a theme among the new philanthropies. I'm just going to highlight some of the words in these quotes. I have a ton of slides. And Peter Buffett, who is the son of Warren Buffett, came out in 2013 with a New York Times op-ed calling, like basically as a whistleblower for grand philanthropy, and calling it out as actually doing more harm than good, and as a form of conscience laundering was what he called it. So I'm going to be reading to you a brief introduction to a chapter that I co-wrote with colleague Dr. Robert Carpenter at Eastern Michigan University. There are very similar things happening at the state universities across the country, and we've noticed a lot of different patterns in K-12 and in higher ed. We have long known that corporate power and influence shape education policies. We're now learning about new forms of technological power that are engineering policies aimed to privatize, corporatize, datafy nearly all aspects of public education as for-profit opportunities. These investments are crafted for a new breed of private sector entrepreneur, the social venture capitalist, who applies investing principles to the social realm of community programs and schools. On the surface, these investments appear to be altruistic gifts from the business and philanthropic sector to ease constrained public budgets. Many of these funds are not gifts, however, but tools of data extraction, the real costs of which will be paid with behavioral and cognitive data harvested from teachers, parents, and students to serve as measurable outcomes of impact to guarantee returns on investment for social venture capital if agreed upon metrics are made. At the root of stagnating wages and declining working conditions for teachers is the mantra of efficiency, so popular with austerity programs across the globe and scripted curricula in classrooms. Teachers, through strikes and other actions, have pushed back and demanded accountability for the profiteering enabled by school districts and states as they engage with corporate philanthropists and educational technology companies in endeavors of dubious value to them. As we investigated the roots of Silicon Valley's policy involvement in education, we found at the core a convergence of tech, wealth, philanthro-capitalism, and intersecting entities aligned in promoting practices and policies that prioritize technology, big data, and algorithmic decision-making over teachers and the democratic governance of education. We explore here how key players within the tech and philanthropy sectors are driving policy shifts from human relational school-based learning to anytime, anywhere, digitized content and assessments. Such shifts involve a strategic confluence of doublespeak messaging in the name of access and equity with learning management systems, software programs, and behavioral data extraction that dehumanize, personalize, track, and ultimately genuine efforts for equity and access. So that's a lot, right? Silicon solutions, let's look at where these are coming from. We focused on, first of all, I want to share what are these Philanthro-Capitalist foundations that I'm talking about. I'm just going to continue to read a little bit because it's going to connect the dots. A host of billionaires are responsible for tech initiatives that have ushered in technologies and practices poised to dismantle public education. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Broad Foundation, Lumina Foundation, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Bezos Family Fund, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundations, among others, have poured millions of dollars into education settings and are among the most widely known philanthro-capitalists in education. Our inquiry, however, looks back in time over the past decade to reveal the workings of two lesser known but highly influential organizations, Global Silicon Valley and the Philanthropy Roundtable, in their push to shift education from public to private, from people to profit, and from teachers to tech. So I have a slide here that describes the segment on Global Silicon Valley. They describe themselves as the modern merchant bank. Several links here around the different arms that they have that actually organize the power and the messaging and communication to be able to roll out the technology. They wrote a report back in 2012 called American Revolution 2.0, how education innovation is going to revitalize America and transform the US economy. It was published on July 4th as a kind of a tribute to Independence Day. Let's be independent of our public systems was apparently the theme. And part of their strategic battle plan, and it's mapped out in like 15-year step ladder. And in the middle of it, and it's actually happened lockstep. If you look at actually the things that they have planned to do, I initially thought this has got to be a joke, that you're kidding me that they've actually predicted this, but it's actually happened. And the one that hasn't yet, thank goodness, is that, but it is part of the plan, is to eliminate locally elected school boards. Page 292 of that document. It was public several years ago. We've taken it down. I do have a copy if folks are interested. The Philanthropy Roundtable is another organization. They have published a 150-page document, the Wise Giver's Guide to Blended Learning and incorporating educational technology. Again, this is before the pandemic, and they basically were piloting a lot of these new technologies in charter schools and private schools, and creating that sense of got to keep up with the Joneses, so that the public schools say, oh no, we better keep up. And so then they ushered in a lot of these tech programs into public education. Here you have one of the chapters that talks about the bottleneck. It's a lack of research. They acknowledge that there's actually a lack of research on the effectiveness of these programs. And yet, and even Scott Benson from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation acknowledging that part of me is really nervous that the dialogue and the enthusiasm is outpacing the results. And yet in the next chapter, it was just dozens of strategies for pushing more of this technology into the schools. And again, they're predominantly focusing on pushing the tech into low-income schools with predominantly Black and Latino, Black and Brown kids. And so it's just something we have to pay attention to in terms of power and voice, and who is actually benefiting and not, and the intersections of academics as well. What voice should we have to play? Where are we not speaking up when we should be in these kinds of situations? Here's an example. This Buzz software is one of the ones that's promoted in that Global Silicon Valley report. Agilix is one of the other names of it. And there's an investigative piece in Detroit by Kurt Guyette, won an award around exposing this concern about this ed tech program that was actually not working. It was broken. There were all kinds of problems with it. And yet, one of the innovation pushing tech foundations, Getting Smart, is highlighting it as a success. And unless we pay attention to what's happening on the ground, and with some of these, white papers or, like the marketing around these things, we're gonna miss these mismatches and end up ushering in innovations that are actually, unfortunately, going to be more forms of exploitation. I mentioned before that Peter Buffett has called this out. I'm sure there are many others who have, and there's sorry, I need to take a breath. there's this awareness that there's this mismatch, and I kind of think of it as a parallel of where people are starting to recognize that, oh, wait a second, maybe it's not a good idea for folks with, you know, privilege and power to go and like tell others to, you know, how to do things. I think we have to understand this at the larger picture around like the philanthropies, and they're telling us about how to solve our graduation gaps or how to use AI and all of these things. We've got to really draw from our own wisdom internally within our own institutions and our colleagues and students and communities to decide how we want to do things. And this is just, I thought, a really powerful quote. People, including me, this is Peter Buffett speaking, who had very little knowledge of a particular place, would think that they could solve a local problem, whether it involved farming methods, education practices, job training, or business development. Over and over, I would hear people discuss transplanting what worked in one setting directly into another, with little regard for culture, geography, or societal norms. And if you look at the patterns of what we see in Silicon Valley and the culture of move fast and break things and scale things up, I can't count how many times I have heard of similar kinds of language around the initiatives that once we figure out what to do, we have got to scale it up. And these are for social projects. And so we have to really have a critical lens and understand what's happening. Again, this term, a charitable industrial complex, has been brought in to describe what's happening. There are a lot of, you know, the rich keep getting richer, right? And they got to put their money somewhere. And so one of the new financial schemes is basically to have donor advised funds. These go into, they're basically tax exempt, and, you know, charities are, you know, are basically holding the money and then donating it later. So there's more to that. I'm not going to get into it, but here you can see donor advised funds are increasingly offering impact investing options. And so where does social emotional learning, like how did this slide get in the middle of all of this stuff about finances? They should be worlds apart, right? But no. Again, I mentioned my early research was on social emotional learning and the evaluation of violence prevention programs in schools. And here's the connection. It used to be that social emotional learning, how am I doing with time, by the way? I keep looking at the clock. I've got another 10 minutes, I hope, okay. So early social emotional learning, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was really focused on relationships and empathy. And I call it the authentic, grassroots, old school social emotional learning. In the past decade, we've seen this shift. There's this emphasis on the 5 core competencies. I think it's helpful to understand what those are. There's questions about the cultural, you know, if there's cultural relevance to the way that we're doing social emotional learning, but then there's also a pushback, and there's an influx of ed tech companies that are coming to schools and telling them, we're going to help you measure social emotional learning. We're going to help you improve school climate and improve school safety, and give us your kids and give us your data. And that's really what's going on. And so there's also a shift to the skills-based parts of social emotional learning. And I'm seeing less of an emphasis on the relational and empathic. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Briceño for the amazing work that she's doing with her students to, you know, embed authentic social emotional learning, empathy, the kinds of things that you described, Allison, were really the kind of things we want to be doing in classrooms to build that I consider it the old school social emotional learning. So here's where we have to look at the bigger picture, because, and this is something that's been difficult for me as someone who has for 15 years been an advocate for social emotional learning, to have to take a step back and say, hold on, we've got to differentiate between what we're talking about, if it's grassroots, or if the new Philanthro-Capitalists, the folks, you know, Aspen Institute's doing a bunch of stuff, and trying to monetize data and impact projects that would extract social emotional behavioral data. This is a piece in 2019 by Ben Williamson, who's a prolific writer and researcher who's been writing with critical perspectives about datafication in both higher education and K-12 systems. And he's written this piece with critical perspectives about social emotional learning and the impact investment markets. Just last week, a colleague in the School of Information, Dr. Michelle Villagrán, had sent me this article about artificial intelligence infiltrating higher education. And this is a pattern that we're seeing over and over again. We've got to pay attention to this. We have to open our eyes. We are in 2021 here. But here's an example company that is attempting to evaluate and judge students on their soft skills. That's another kind of code word for SEL, but they tend to use that more in higher education. And then it caught my eye that they're doing, these openness, motivation, agreeableness, and neuroticism. For those of you who may remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal back in 2018, these are the 5 ocean or canoe, however you want to do the acronym, personality traits that were taken by Cambridge Analytica and then weaponized in political ads. This is actually happening. The tactics are the same. Even though Cambridge Analytica is shut down, it doesn't mean that these kinds of data are not being taken. And unfortunately, in education, it's being done in the name of SEL, in the name of soft skills for work readiness. And so we have to pay attention. We are on May 6th right now, as today is the date, right? 2021. We're smack in the middle of what is being called the 4th Industrial Revolution. These are some of the things that you're going to see some of our colleagues in science and tech and all the STEM fields, right? They're innovating and doing all these new things. Well, the big data and analytics over here is where education fits in, and the kinds of data that we're extracting are going into that. So what does this mean for the future of education? Who is going to shape the future of learning? This is a piece from 2013, pre-pandemic, way pre-pandemic, with kind of a plan for what's the future of learning going to look like. You're going to recognize a lot of these things are actually happening now. And what's concerning to me, I'm just going to highlight here, is this last one here, and these are just the slides are, those little circles are difficult to see, so there's just larger text on the right. Oops. Those learning playlists might include public schools, but could also include a wide variety of digitally mediated or place-based learning experiences. So as we look to the future of learning, how are we going to protect and maintain some semblance of public education as well as a way to keep our communities together and not have it be completely dispersed into these tech tools that are also extracting behavioral data? So in higher ed, you're going to see some hashtags. Some of the way that they do the doublespeak around this is they say, this is tech for good. So there's a hashtag tech for good and, data for good. On that hashtag, I also noticed skill bursts. And I was like, that's interesting skills. What's that? So skill bursts are coming. And this is often, sometimes there's like double hashtags. But this is, again, and you're going to hear these same sorts of ads for let's make sure that we get those folks who have left the university, but they want to complete their degrees and come back. And this is a non-university based program, again, with impact investing behind it, where they want to do gamification and then tell you what job you should get. My concern about some of those unbundling proposals are that they're going to be giving these itty bitty cheaper versions of education. And unless there's a parallel emphasis that college degrees are also worth getting, and there's a pipeline or some sort of like support for continued real education, I think we're going to be in some concerning spaces. And by the way, I should also say, I'm coming with some critical perspectives, and I know that the entire field is not this way. So to the folks who are doing some of these initiatives, let's talk together. I'm in a collaborative mode around my critiques and wanting us all to at least be on the same page of understanding where the funding and the potential data concerns are. Early education is a really burgeoning market. I'm going to go quickly through these slides, and I will make these available on a resource page that I've put at the end of my slide deck. This is a slide with gratitude to a colleague in Philadelphia, Allison Briceño, who has done a ton of work looking at the plans for Silicon Valley and education. I've adapted some of that here to look at the whole child data collection. I've added some here under chatbots for higher ed, and also I've noticed a trend of early warning and risk algorithms that are being adopted to try to, in the name of support students, but then also they label students in ways that could be weaponized later. So why all this concern? Why did I bring give you all of that? Because we've got to take care of our students, not just while they are with us in the universities or in our K-12 systems. We've got to be thinking long term and ensure that while they're in our care, we are not unwittingly or unintentionally in some way doing harm. This is the first do no harm tenet of that they say in medicine that I think we should also do in education. The data extraction, obviously, this is bigger than us. You know, I don't know what the answers are to this, but these are some of the data harms. This is from the Data Justice Lab in the UK. You can read them there. There's also a list. Oh gosh, how am I doing the time here? Yeah, 5 minutes. Mark, can I go another 3 minutes?
Go for it, Roxana.
Okay, thank you. So this is just from the Coded Bias website as well. They also documented some of the AI harms. So there's individual harms, there's collective social harms. There's an amazing collection of database, this bit.ly link with the AI controversy, if you wanted to see some of the other concerns around AI in other fields. So big picture, whose data, which rights and whose power? When we talk about student voice and student engagement and, you know, respect for students, we've got to include them in these conversations and be honest about what's happening and work collectively together to ensure that there are protections against data exploitation. And I don't know how else we're going to do it. This is why you see this is such a difficult presentation to share. I do not want to be sharing these things, but I feel ethically compelled to. So this is just a visual that I put together of the Philanthro-Capitalism. This is what we see on the surface, but underneath it is a privatization of public education and social services. They're also privatizing the impact research sector to say, oh, this project worked or not. And that takes away the protections from students of IRB, of, you know, being able to opt out of being part of these research studies. Again, I talked earlier about innovation or exploitation, and then some of the emerging technologies that we have to be aware of and concerned about are the one I'm most concerned about is blockchain digital identity systems that are often being used as the impact metrics for these social impact bonds or social impact investing projects. In short, blockchain digital identity systems, it's like a long-term digital ledger. You can reverse data, but you can never delete it. And so if you can imagine that you're a child and you've either been suspended or something happened, they put false data on your blockchain and you can never have it removed. And that data, those data are going to follow you for the rest of your life and be put into any kind of these algorithmic models that could false flag you for, you know, something that you may not have done. This is the big picture concern. Written about this in a policy brief from the National Education Policy Center around impact investing. And the NAACP also has a resolution opposing blockchain digital identity systems. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to know where they are. They're oftentimes part of some of these badges and micro-credentials, and in a higher ed, it's used as this form of kind of trust verification. So isolated in that way, it sounds like a wonderful thing, but unless you see the bigger picture of what's behind this, it's really, it's troubling. There's 3 layers of exploitation themes that I talked about before. Dollars get put into private companies instead of, you know, being used for the public, democracy, and data. And I want to share this one. There's challenges in prevention of data exploitation, but I'd like to share a 2-minute video. Actually, there's some books I recommend too. Oh, what just happened? I did not mean to do that. That went straight to the book. And let me go back to the presentation. I made these live links and they're a little too live right now. So, but these are some books that have informed my thinking and research. And if racism is a systemic issue, we really have to be interdisciplinary and understand the money systems that we're in and the ways that these data are intersecting across these systems. Highly recommend these books. Kenneth Saltman's Swindle of Innovative Educational Finance was one that really opened my eyes to the doublespeak. That we're under something called the apology model of data extraction right now. This is the model that's happening. They take as much data as they want, and then if they get caught, they say, sorry, we won't do it again. And sometimes they follow that promise and sometimes they don't. But again, is this culturally sustaining or culturally erasing? What I want to play is a video. Can you all hear that?
Actually, we can't hear it, Roxana. We're also down to only 1 minute left. Did you want to take questions?
I'd really like to share this video if it would be possible.
Okay.
Thank you.
Containing 5 million students using a technology called PRISM integrated in the Cardano blockchain. Every one of these students will have a digital ID called a DID, and that DID carries with it metadata that will travel with them throughout their entire academic life, and like those who left Facebook's clutches of the university into the real world, will actually follow them into the economic world. So as they graduate, as they go into the economy, eventually this infrastructure can be used for property, for payments, for voting, and all other manners of their economic life. And what's beautiful about this evergreen deal is it's extensible. Our priorities and goals are directly aligned with the vision and priorities and goals of the Ethiopian government. In a recently published doctrine of Ethiopia 2025, there was a bold vision to digitize the country on 4 pillars, the first of which was a national ID system. It is our belief that the work we have done here with PRISM and Cardano for these 5 million students will inevitably grow to be an inspiration and perhaps the system for 107 million Ethiopians, allowing them for the first time to globalize on equal terms with the United States, the European Union, China, and other modern developed economies. In addition to this system goes far beyond just identity. Our belief is that it can be used to help people procure jobs, to help people prove their skills, because the system can verify credentials, the system can verify certificates, the system can be used for a litany of activities which are required for people to understand who are credible actors to deal with and who have earned the right to have a job.
And I think it's the ending that clearly I'm not showing this video as a promotional thing. I'm very concerned because we're allowing companies like that to determine who's worthy of having a job. So sorry that I've gone over. My goodness, I see 19 chats here that I have not had a chance to read. And I'm really sorry for going over. Could we stay on, anyone who would like to talk?
If you'd like to stay on, you're more than welcome to do so. We can keep this webinar open. If you've got any questions out there, please do drop your questions in the chat, or you can request to come off mute and Brian can help you with that. Roxana, you have lots of kudos
Thank you.
In the chat, and a lot of links to other sources of information kind of supporting some of the work that you were describing there.
Thank you. I'm going to put in the chat just a couple of it's a resource page that I put together with some colleagues in a faculty learning community around data justice links. I'll be posting my presentation slides there, and it also includes information more about blockchain and impact bonds and all the other stuff that I had shared. So I hope that's helpful. I'm sorry, I still have like 2 slides left, but I'm not going to do them.
No worries, there's a lot to share.
I know, it was a lot.
We have a hand up from Debbie Klein, I believe I saw.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Kevin. Debbie, hi Debbie. Oh my goodness, good to see you, Debbie.
Hi, it's great to be here. And I actually didn't mean to have my hand up, so I apologize for that. But
please share.
I'll just say that I'm a big fan of your work, and I was about to put in the chat that I, as you know, am part of the California Community Colleges. I'm a president of the Faculty Association, and we have been dealing with so many of these issues that you raise in our system. The big effort to really shrink and defund public education and our mission as a system has been a huge problem for us in the last 2 decades. And right now, some of you may have been hearing about City College of San Francisco going through the potential of hundreds of faculty layoffs as a way to sort of save, do austerity budgeting. So I just wanted to thank you for contextualizing the big picture, and I really look forward to your work in the future, and also joining forces.
Thank you so much. You're one of the only other scholars I know who actually also studies Philanthro-Capitalism. So thank you for your work as well. Thank you.
Roxana, I had a quick question. So I really appreciated that you're summing up sort of the dollars, democracy, and data as kind of the three areas of concern and exploitation. And I'm wondering, to what extent have people been able to use FERPA as a way to kind of push back at the blockchain technology that you were talking about earlier? Because there are laws against, you know, the sharing of that information. So is that an avenue that the ACLU or anybody else has used to fight that?
Unfortunately, so you're right, the FERPA exists. Unfortunately, it's toothless and it's really focused on content data. What the problem with blockchain and many of these other technologies, and especially like Canvas that I've been looking into, is that they're taking metadata. Metadata are the behavioral data. And so there's no protections right now for the behavioral data. And that's what's of most interest to the investors, because they want to be able to see who was on time with an assignment, who was late, who's conscientious, who's not, those 5 ocean characteristics. And that goes into the data that's going to be fueling human capital futures markets, which sounds dystopian and horrible, but they're trying to say who is worthy of a job in 20 years, who's worthy of health insurance, who should have a higher credit card, interest rate than the other person. And it's the social credit scoring through these behavioral data that's really, we don't have the protections right now. My dream would be to have like a year of reassigned time or something to go work with the legislature to be able to put in some legislative protections. Because I think with the other strategies, they keep us so busy and so running the rat race that no one in the public has the bandwidth to be able to fight this or to put protections in. Anyway, I just, there's always a little glimmer of optimism in me, even though this is I bring up these dystopian, horrible things. So thank you for asking the question. And FERPA is unfortunately you'll see on every app, this is FERPA compliant. Well, that means nothing, actually. It doesn't protect you. FERPA will not protect you. So good question, though.
Are there any other questions from the audience? I see there's more. There's some people, lots of thanks and more connections that people are making.
Thank you.
Hi, it looks like I got unmuted. Is that my cue to?
Yes, go for it,
Yes.
Dolores.
Dr. Marachi, oh my God, thank you so much. I am a graduate student in counselor education, and I'm graduating this semester. And I wrote my final project last semester, and I wrote it on Philanthro-Capitalism was in there.
No way. Wow.
Yeah.
Good for you.
AI, the question of how AI is going to impact jobs. And this was pre-pandemic, right? And we just saw a kind of acceleration of they're predicting that like all these blue collar jobs are just going to just go away. Yep. And in counselor education, part of our mandate is to do career counseling. And we didn't have one little peep about this impending, total change of the entire work situation, like the future of work. They've been talking about the pathways of work, for like 30 years. And now it's here where all these different technologies are going to really reshape everything we have known about class, working class power to unionize, so basically, there's this thing that they're saying is, all the industrialists are saying, well, we got to retool people, and educators are responding to that and saying, well, we got to have these programs to really educate people really fast with these new technologies. And then there's this other professor in England who's like, no, you need to be organizing people because this is a class issue. It's a perpetual class issue. And as long as big technology has all this immense power that people don't even know how they're being affected, people don't even know the impact on democracy. Like, 100%. I mean, there is.
I want to work with you. Where are you? Let's connect.
I'm gonna connect with you. I'm gonna send you an email. So anyway, I'm just like, wow.
Fantastic. Good to hear that there's
feel like it. When I saw your your disclaimer, I was like, oh boy, that says a lot about, about addressing these issues on San Jose State, because we have created this whole like badge of honor. We are taking marginalized students and feeding them into the technology industry and patting ourselves on the back for that. And I'm like, what the hell? This is not social justice to be training folks of color to be entering all these oppressive technologies with no critical kind of dialogue.
Gotta have our eyes wide open, right?
Yes.
Eyes wide open. We gotta know what's happening, at least if we have a chance of fighting it. Yeah. Thank you. That means the world to me. Thank you so much. Definitely look forward to connecting. And thank you, Mark, for inviting this session. Heather, I know she had to leave, and Allison for presenting. I think that's just, it's so important that we keep culturally sustaining pedagogies and keep our education human. And I mean, it's obviously there's going to be technology, but we can certainly, it's not inevitable. The direction that it's going in is not inevitable. We've got to at least hold that. So thank you. I don't know what to do.
Thank you, Roxana, and thank you, Allison, both for coming today and sharing your ideas with the faculty and with students in our college and actually beyond. I saw a lot of folks from outside the college as well. So a round of applause to the two of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That closes out our Faculty Symposium series for 2020-21, but we will continue the series in the fall. We're working right now to set up the next line of talks. So glad everyone could make it. We still have a lot of attendees here, so clearly folks were really interested in today's talk. Thanks again, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.